Thanks for that introduction, George, and I just want to extend my thanks to you, Graham, for agreeing to speak with us today at Farm Riders and share your perspectives on infrastructure. So if we might kick off straight into it. So Infrastructure New South Wales has been around for about 6 years and obviously has an important role in the planning and delivery of infrastructure projects in New South Wales. Just to set the scene, I was hoping you could perhaps provide an overview of its role, objectives and key priorities.
Okay, more than happy to talk about that, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to talk about a subject which, if you'll forgive the expression, I could talk about under wet cement. I think Infrastructure New South Wales has been one of the most interesting things I've done in my directorial career. It has been in existence for a bit over 6 years. I was made the chairman I was invited to be the chairman by Barry O'Farrell as the Premier 4 years ago, and I've enjoyed the 4 years. Gladys Berejiklian has just asked me to take another 4-year term, and I've agreed. I don't think I could have hit a more interesting time to be advising a government on infrastructure priorities, particularly since it was a government that had an ability to deliver on projects and the funds to do so. So just a bit of background on what we do and why we were set up. I think if we all think back to the global financial crisis, Prime Minister Rudd at the time wanted to spend money in the economy, wanted to stimulate to avoid a loss of jobs, and had 10 billion or more to offer to the states to fund infrastructure projects. I think New South Wales got about 100 million of that only. Here we are, a third of the economy, and the reason was the cupboard was bare in terms of well-planned projects that could be shovel-ready, whereas other states had things that they'd been backlogging and planning for some time. And so New South Wales missed out big time. And the incoming O'Farrell government said, we're not going to let that happen again. So they created Infrastructure New South Wales to stimulate good planning and long-term planning for what the priorities of infrastructure were going to be in the state. I'll talk about its structure perhaps later, but the principal objectives were firstly to provide the government with every 5 years a 20-year priority list of the priority infrastructure projects that we recommend the state invest in, fund itself, or stimulate private investment in. We then, secondly, every year provide a 5-year priority list, usually within that overall envelope, to inform the budget preparation. And so far we've been kicking pretty nearly 100% goals on those recommendations. They're private recommendations, the government, we don't publish those, but the 20-year priority list has to be publicly launched, so it's a public document, and the government therefore feels a need to publicly respond to it. And the rationale for all that is that you can then get some more informed debate in the community about what the priorities really are. And if the government chooses to ignore our priorities, which it has every right to do, there will be at least a basis for a public debate on whether they are making the right choices and allocating the funds in the right place. So that's our advisory function. We have a second function, which was to do specific projects to assist the Premier to improve the delivery of infrastructure. So, for example, he's asked us over the years to do a project on how public departments manage their contingencies. And what we found, and those of you in private sector here will find this strange, but I bring a private sector hat to the board, which is what the aim is. But to find that government departments had contingencies of 30 to 50% typically on major projects, 30 to 50%, not 3 to 5%. And what's more, they weren't actually unique to the project. They could be shuffled around between projects. So interestingly enough, no projects ever overran their contingencies. And so we did some work to advise on a better way of managing contingencies. And of course the answer there was, do better planning up front so you have a much better ability to give a P90 contingency rather than P50. So that's an example. Other examples would be sector-specific reviews. In that context, we were commissioned just a couple of years ago to do a cultural infrastructure strategy for the state to compare where we were on cultural infrastructure, everything from theatres to art galleries and so on, both city and regional, and compare us with international benchmarks, and then come up with a recommendation to government. Not yet a public document, though I'm still hopeful it will be soon, although the last budget essentially followed our priority recommendations. So those are the kind of sector-specific projects that we can do. So they're the two main functions we had for the first few years, 3 years of the last 6. The first state infrastructure strategy was delivered in 2012, and then when Premier Baird took office in early 2 years later, 18 months later, he said, look, I'm going to seek a mandate to sell or lease 49% of the poles and wires. I think we'll generate around 18 or 19 billion. Would you do a report, an update on your priority list to tell me how I should spend it to best effect? And so it's not very often that, even as chairman of the companies I've been involved in, that somebody comes and says, how should I spend 20 billion? So we had a lot of fun, but we only had 9 months or less than 9 months to do that. And of course, we all know Baird got the mandate. And so that was an update on our first task. Just briefly, I'll mention, Meredith, the 2 other functions which have been given to us in the last 2 years. And I take it as a sign of confidence in that we're doing things that the government values. One is we have an assurance role. We are an assurance authority that looks at every capital project involving taxpayers' money over 10 million, which is a very small number, and reviews them and reports to the Cabinet as to whether or not those projects are on track, on time, on budget, and likely to deliver the expected outcome. And of course, we don't spend a lot of time on the 10 million projects. There's something like 600 or 700 projects in that list. We spend our time on the 50 to 100 high-profile, high-risk projects, and are able then to give the government early warning and of course work with the heads of departments who might ultimately be responsible for cost overruns or delays to work with them on the solution and how to get things back on the track, as it were. And the last task which we have, although it's not new, is that we could be nominated by the Premier as the delivery authority to actually be responsible for development as the owner of it, as it were. The only one that we had in the early days was the Darling Harbour renewal, which was a very complex, nearly $3 billion public-private partnership. We engaged Lend-Lease as the partner, and we delivered a new convention centre, a new exhibition centre, a new theatre, and rejuvenated the accommodation with a new hotel and a bunch of apartments and commercial buildings. And the reason that was given to us is that the Sydney Foreshores Authority that owned the land had never done anything like that, and the Premier felt that he needed someone who might have the right expertise. So that's been formalised just recently, and we've been designated as Projects New South Wales, which essentially means the Premier can nominate projects for us to be the delivery authority of. We've asked him not to do too many, and there are, of course, very capable government departments who do many projects and have all the expertise you need, like delivering hospitals or delivering schools. But when it comes to ones that are a bit unusual, that might involve many cross-departmental interfaces, which can often impede successful delivery, or if they're particularly sensitive, he will nominate us. So at the moment we're handling and building the new Western Sydney Stadium at Parramatta. Arts and sports haven't built a stadium ever before or for the last 30, 40 years, so we're doing that. We're responsible for the new Grafton Correction Centre or jail, a 1,700-bed jail at Grafton, which we'll be the delivery authority on. And at the other end of the spectrum, in terms of scale, but not necessarily in terms of complexity, we're responsible for the Lint Cafe Siege Memorial in Martin Place, which is a sub-$2 million project, but obviously very sensitive one in terms of the families, the victims, and the interface that project will have with the new Sydney Metro, which is going to mean pulling up a great deal of Martin Place over the next little while. So that's the kind of sensitive project that we've been given.
Great. Thanks very much for that overview, Graham. My understanding is that Infrastructure New South Wales is quite a unique body, having regard to the way other states and indeed federally, the way infrastructure is planned and delivered. Perhaps you could comment from your perspectives on the benefits of having a body such as Infrastructure New South Wales. And I think in the context of, you've just described the priorities and functions of Infrastructure New South Wales planning and delivery. How does Infrastructure New South Wales go about engaging with other regulatory bodies or other parts of government?
Yeah, okay. Well, we were unique for a long time, but now people, are imitating us, and I guess imitation's the highest form of flattery. So Queensland set up a comparable body called Building Queensland. Victoria has now got Infrastructure Victoria, and I'm told Tasmania is about to create such a body, and I also understand the new government of Western Australia is looking at the model as well. So, but when we were set up, there are bodies around the world, Ontario, London. There were a few models that I guess the architects of our structure looked at, but none of them look very much like us, and so we're an evolution. And we have a great deal more independence than any of those bodies, and we do actually have, I think, a really extraordinary degree of independence from government, which is one of the strengths of the model. George, you talked about the challenge of trying to match a China, which can have a 20-year plan that is sort of, absolutely mandated. We'll probably never get there, and that's probably part of our democratic history, and that's fine. But I'm still a great believer that if you've got maybe it's not 20 years, but if you've even got a 10 or a 15-year set of infrastructure priorities that are committed by government and expected by the community, that is a bulwark against, losing track and changing priorities. I learnt when I was in Sweden on a business mission a few years ago that Sweden and other Scandinavian countries have for quite a long time had models. They're robust democracies too, but they have models where the Parliament will debate the 15-year infrastructure plan and approve it. And if there's a change of government, and there was one in Sweden 6 months before I talked to the minister responsible for this, he said, well, I wouldn't dare change anything. I could add to it, but I wouldn't change it because the whole community is expecting that train to go in, and they're expecting that road to be fixed, and they're expecting that, that airport to be upgraded, and we wouldn't dare change it. So I think the genesis of Infrastructure New South Wales is to try to get a longer-term planning process that somehow locks in the political process. Now, you can never really lock it in a democracy because governments have every right to make their choose what priorities they want and to be answerable to the electors on that basis. But the things that are unique about us, the thing that the model is, the independence comes from the structure of the board. So the structure is an independent chairman, 5 independent directors with relevant business background, and I'm pleased to acknowledge Roger Fletcher, who's one of my colleagues on the board, who does a sterling job at the board of making sure we don't overlook rural and regional priorities, and has served on the board, I think, right from the beginning, haven't you, Roger? Yeah. So made a terrific contribution. We then have 3 heads of department that are central agencies but not recipients of infrastructure money. So that's Premiers, Treasury and Planning Department. So we actually have around the table some of the senior government department heads, and we quite often can resolve issues, interdepartmental issues and so on around that table, around projects. I have also, because transport is such a big recipient, and because we need to work very closely with them, in order to cement their cooperation and collaboration with us, I've issued a standing invitation to the head of transport to attend all of our board meetings, which Tim Reardon does. And that's always also helps us to get projects discussed, debated, and hopefully moved forward with the relevant players in the room. The other thing which is unique, and this will take a minute to explain, but it is worth it, because the O'Farrell government did, and of course Mike Baird as treasurer and Gladys as part of that cabinet, did a very what was to say, a self-sacrificing thing. But it's proven to be, I think, a worthy model, and it is still unique amongst the other states, and that is they committed that all of the public assets that were sold, the ports, the power stations, of course, poles and wires, but even if it was a block of land next to a school, if it was a public asset that was being sold, the money must go, net of debt, must go into the Restart Fund, which they labelled it. And the Restart Fund cannot be spent without the approval of the Infrastructure New South Wales Board. In other words, a department can come to us and say, we want to build a light rail in, Grafton or somewhere, and we'll look at it and say, well, I'm sorry, Minister, it doesn't meet our return criteria, which are a minimum of a benefit cost ratio of 1, and we tend to target 1.5, and we have projects that have benefit cost ratios in the double digits. Then we can say no. By all means, go ahead and do it, but take it out of taxpayers' money. Don't take it out of the recycled assets. And the notion there is a compact with the community that if public assets are sold, there'll be something to show for it at the end of the day, that the money won't simply flow into consolidated revenue and disappear. And that was a deliberate policy, because the Liberal government said, look, we've been through a couple of mining boom in New South Wales. We've also been through a couple of property booms, and frankly, there's no infrastructure to show. There's no long-term legacy from all that, and we don't want that to happen again. So that is the way we run it, and the Restart Fund, including the poles and wires money now, is just about nudging up to $30 billion, which we then can recommend how it will be allocated or reserved for particular projects. And then when those projects are approved by the government, they have to say yes, of course. We will then scrub them, the business cases, and move them through to final approval, and then things go from a reservation of potential spend into an actual allocation in the budget process. Great.
Thanks, Graham. I'm very pleased you mentioned the Restart Fund, because we're a Farm Riders audience. Farm Riders audience will be interested to know that, as I understand, 30% of the Restart Fund is allocated to rural and regional projects. I was hoping you'd be able to give us an overview of how Infrastructure New South Wales sources proposals for you to hopefully approve and spend some of that money on. And as a second part, give us an overview of what some of those projects that you have undertaken, in particular those that support rural or regional communities.
Absolutely. So you're right, 30% of Restart has to be spent outside of Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong. At that number now is that it's reserved and allocated is about 9.2 billion. Almost all of that has been allocated, in many cases not to a specific project yet, but to a program, right? Like fixing country roads, or country freight pinch points, or country water security programs, within which we will then seek the departments responsible to come forward with their priorities, and then we have the responsibility of reviewing them and advising the government on which ones meet the criteria. So projects are typically sourced from the departments, but they can also come from the local communities, from councils and other community groups. We also have been asked at times to run a program to solicit proposals under the umbrella of a particular program. To give an example is bridges for the bush, right? We've got hundreds of wooden bridges in New South Wales. Many of them are old and need replacement if it's cost effective to do that. Many of them mean that trucks can't carry full loads, and so trucks have to divert sometimes many scores of kilometres to get to a bridge they can cross, and there's a big need to address that. But so what the government did some years ago was to say, we'd like to allocate $100 million to bridges. You go and solicit proposals from local government, and you review them, and you come and tell us which ones you think we should put first, second and third. And part of that, the benefit of that process was that the parliamentarians could then firstly have an objective view, and secondly be less prone to have every council in the state lobbying them in Macquarie Street for their particular bridge. And so we've got a series of those umbrella programs where we will solicit the programs, and then we'll invite experts. And again, I acknowledge Roger's contribution. He's been chairing many of the review committees, looking at the projects that get through the screen to come up with the priorities. So that's broadly the way it works. I've just got a few notes here because there's so many projects on the go, but I've got, I want to mention a few here that are relevant to the rural and regional sector. We have one of the big ones that, and these all came, these are the allocations that came through in the 2017-18 budget in June. So this is not the full program. Some of these, will go over many years with significantly larger total expenditure, but the Pacific Highway upgrade, for example, it's been going on for a number of years now. It was one of our key priorities, get a duplicated highway from one end of the state to the other. Commonwealth money has been significantly helpful in that through what's called nowadays the National Partnership Program. Somewhat confusingly, that program was not renewed in the last federal budget, so we're not quite sure what the Commonwealth's commitment beyond 2019 is going to be to supporting those major road projects, where they've been providing well over half the money for many years. But the Pacific Highway project has been a major commitment. We've got a new intercity train fleet, and that's a $1 billion plus project to replace basically all of the intercity trains. New South Wales, $400 million to be spent this year. Water security for regions, there's $350 allocated for that. The Grafton Bridge, it's a $177 million bridge that we're building there to cross the river and bypass the existing flood-prone bridge area. Regional freight pinch points, $100 million allocated, already quite a bit spent, and probably more to come. As I mentioned, Bridges for the Bush gets another $135 million this year. So a series of those programs, not including the hospital and education and other programs, which also we get to review, and some of that money will come out of the Restart Fund as well.
Thanks, Graham. I can imagine when you announce to councils and other parties there's a fund and what should we spend it on, you get knocked down in the rush. But I imagine that some of the ideas may not be fully formed. I also understand that Infrastructure New South Wales recently reviewed the process for calling for proposals. Be interested to hear from you on what you see as some of the key factors that could contribute to you having a stronger pipeline of projects or fully formed proposals for you to assess.
Yeah. Well, a couple of comments on that, Meredith. It has been a matter of some concern to us and to the government that we haven't been knocked down in the rush quite as much as we had expected. Of course, when you call for a specific, like bridges, you'll get plenty of them coming forward. But in general, I think local government in the regions have had a couple of issues to deal with. One is it's taken a while for them to believe that there really is a government that can fund things and is wanting to do so. That might sound strange, but we've got a long history in every state in Australia of governments over-promising and under-delivering. And the second issue is, of course, a lot of rural and regional projects are delivered by councils and local contractors, who want to see a steady amount of work in their region, not a volatile and peaky amount of. So they'll kind of moderate what their ambitions are to some extent. When we've done a bit of research in this, we took the whole board of Infrastructure New South Wales for a couple of days in Dubbo early this year to talk to local business people and community leaders around this issue, and it is clear we could do more, and we will offer more support to local governments to have a better quality reviews done and present their cases better, because quite often the projects will have merit, but the presentation and the preparation is not up to the mark and could be improved, and they don't necessarily have the skills to do that. So we'll be using some of our resources and to help to improve that process. I can assure everyone here that the government, including all of the Cabinet Infrastructure Committee ministers, and they include the Premier, Minister Constance, Minister of Infrastructure, of course, the Deputy Premier, Barilaro, the Planning Minister, the Transport Minister, are all very committed to making sure we do deliver and deliver more quickly on rural and regional projects.
Great, thank you, Graham. So I think, as George mentioned, you wear a number of hats, and one of the other hats which will be of great interest to the room is in your role as Chairman of Graincorp. Obviously, Graincorp, as one of the leading agribusinesses in Australia with a large footprint, also has to deal with infrastructure bottlenecks and constraints. Just wondered if you could provide us with some comments through the lens of your position at Graincorp in terms of the impact of those bottlenecks and the benefits of the work that Infrastructure New South Wales does to help ease those, and obviously conscious that Graincorp itself has to grapple with those issues within your business as well. So if you could share some perspectives.
Sure. Happy to do so, but did you see the big red P on my forehead? I'm still in my provisional. I joined the board on the 1st of March and was invited to chair the company on the 1st of May, so I'm still in my learning phase. But let me make this comment. I've just had the opportunity to spend a couple of days in Oregon and Idaho looking at Graincorp's malting business there. And when you have an interest, when you've got a business focus, you do notice things that I might not have noticed in the past. And what I noticed was all around the Port of Vancouver, where we have our malting works, there's train tracks everywhere. And these have been there for 100 years in some cases. I mean, everyone's got 3 or 4 sidings. There's multiplicity of wharves. There's multiplicity of handling equipment. And you just start to realise how relatively immature we are in terms of the infrastructure we've created for the rural economy. Which of course has been a huge part of North America's and Canada's economy forever, for centuries. And it brought home to me how much better a job we've got to do here. Now, Graincorp is essentially, so far as our storage and logistics business is, we're an infrastructure company. So we own the receival points, we operate the trains, we run terminals at ports, and we're an integral part of getting Australian rural product to global markets in a cost-competitive way. And it's so important that we remain cost-competitive when you see what our competitors can do. No, I'm not just thinking about North American competitors. The board and senior management of Graincorp in early July went to Europe and spent a little study tour looking at the Black Sea grain trade going to Ukraine, one of the big Central European grain producers, where their infrastructure is not up to scratch, but where despite that, and with the cost of shipping and bunker oil these days, they can compete with us effectively in our region. Because their transport costs and their lower cost of production can compete with ours. So we have to do a lot more in Australia to maintain our competitiveness in getting product from farm to port, and then obviously from port to customer. We've tied our hands behind our back on coastal shipping for decades. which I think is a great tragedy. But we can do a lot better on our rail infrastructure, and we at Graincorp have been developing through a project we call Project Regeneration, which I'm sure a lot of people here in the room are familiar with, more efficiency in our grain receival and transportation logistics. And we need to do more of that, and it will depend on support from government, particularly when their assets, such as the rail sidings and so on, need to be improved to improve train loading efficiency. And I think we generally say we've been very pleased with the support and progress we've had in New South Wales, which of course has funding, but we're making progress as well in Victoria and Queensland, because they too recognise the importance of us remaining competitive to take advantage of the opportunities we've got in our region, but globally now, to be a competitive provider of quality foodstuffs.
Great, thanks very much, Graham.